Chapter 9. In the Witch's House. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he had begun very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's bone, Adam's flesh, and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle, and just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but half a djinn and half a giantess, Edmund had got outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brother and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight and to be the prince and later a king, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast, and for what the witch would do with the others. And as far as what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them. Certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or to pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't even true. She was jolly and nice to me. Anyway, much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen anyway. She'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of getting it now. The next thing he realized was that the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it, so he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen, to the far side of the river. It was pretty. Oh, sorry, it wasn't pretty. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then, too, there was no road. He kept slipping into drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over tree trunks and sliding down banks and barking his shins up against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if if he hadn't happened to say to himself, "When I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do will be to make some decent roads." And of course, that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do, and this cheered him up a good deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would have, and how many cars, and all about his private cinema, and where the principal roadways would run, and what laws he could make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place, and when the weather changed. First, the snow stopped. Then the wind sprang up and it became freezing cold. Finally, the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that snow, it made everything almost as bright as day. Only the shadows were rather confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember when he had seen, when they had first arrived at the beavers, a smaller river flowing into the great one lower down? He reached this and turned to follow it up, but the little valley down which it came was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and much overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back, and every time this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, just as if all this had been Peter's fault. But at last he came to a part where it was more level, and the valley opened out, and there on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers. Little towers with pointed needles on them, sharp, sharp, sharp. Wow! They looked like sorcerers' caps, and they shone in the moonlight, and their shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house. But it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on and on past corner and corner of the house. To find the door, he had to go straight round to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gate stood open wide. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if he had not been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then at last he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't moved 1 inch since since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing it turned its head, thought Edmund, in fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund, when it springs at the dwarf, then that will be my chance to escape. But still the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf, and now at last Edmund remembered what the others had said about the white witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this witch turned this lion into stone, and as soon as he thought of that, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of his head were covered with snow. Of course, it must be only a statue. No living animal would have let itself get covered with snow. Then very slowly, and with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now he hardly dared to touch it, but at last he put out his hand very quickly and did. It was a cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that, in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes, and at the same time there came into his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great Aslan that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Pooh! Who's afraid of Aslan? And as he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took out a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles in his eyes. Then he said, "Ya silly old Aslan, how do you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you? But in spite of the scribbles on the face of the great stone, still it looked so terrible and so sad and noble, staring up in the moonlight, that Edmund didn't really get any fun out of cheering at it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all around, standing there, and there rather as the pieces stand on the chessboard when it is halfway through the game. There were stone wolves and bears and foxes and catamountains of stones. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really the spirits of trees. There were great shapes of winged horse and long little creatures that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still in the bright cold moonlight, that it was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard and a great club in its right hand. Even though he knew it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up. Across the threshold lay a wolf. "It's all right. It's all right," he kept saying to himself. "It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me." And he raised his leg to step over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose. With all the hair bristling along its neck, opened a great red mouth, and in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." "If you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak, "my name is Edmund, and I am the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the wood the other day, and I have come to bring her news that my brother and sisters are in Narnia quite close in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold as you value your life." Then it vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest, and presently the gray wolf, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favorite of the queen, or else not so fortunate." And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full as the courtyard had been of statues. The one nearest the door was a little fawn with a very sad expression on its face. And Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close beside this sat the White Witch. "I've come, Your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" "Please, Your Majesty," said Edmund, "I've done the best I can. I brought them quite close. They're in a little house on top of the dam just up the river with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is this all your news?" she asked. "No, Your Majesty," said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all that he had learned before leaving the beaver's house. "What? Aslan?" cried the queen. "Aslan, is this true? If I find you have lied to me—" "Please, I'm only repeating what they said," stammered Edmund. But the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly she summoned the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen with her suddenly, and he appeared. "Make ready our sledge," ordered the witch, "and use the harness without else." Chapter 10. The spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and here's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches. And if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey without nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "But don't we want to get a start as soon as we can?" said Peter. "If we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she looked in here and finds we are gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver. "But we can't get there before her, whatever we do, for she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope?" said Susan. "Now don't go fussing, there's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver. "But just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Course we've got hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true, though, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband. "But it's time we were out of this. And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "That's better. There's 5 loaves for the smallest of us. And that's you, dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," said Mrs. Beaver, allowing her husband to help her into snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is. Yes, it is a great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the road, I suppose? I can't abide the thought that that witch would be fiddling with it and breaking it and stealing it, as likely as not." "Oh, please, please, please hurry," said the 3 children. And so, at last, they all got outside and Mr. Beaver locked the door. It'll slow her down a little bit. And they set off, all carrying loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They were in single file line. First Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path along the trees right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep up to the top, for you can't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through the window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white mazes of treetops and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going ped, 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 ped through the snow in front of her as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired that she almost fell asleep at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thicket bushes. And then, as she came fully awake and found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a hole in the bank which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' rest." "If you hadn't all been in such a fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they lay down, they were all a huddle of clothes together, and what with that being warmed up by their long walk, and they were really snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and sputter a little and stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm afterward, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, although really it had been hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek and saw the cold daylight coming in through the smooth mouth of the cave. And immediately after that she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to the sound, which was the very sound they had been thinking of and sometimes imagining that they heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do. But this really was a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without having been seen. And he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." Oh, great was their surprise when a little later they found Mr. Beaver's voice calling them from just inside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out. Mrs. Beaver, come out. Sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they usually don't talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave and blinking in the daylight and with earth all over them and looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed and with sleep in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter as they scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she'd made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." And then they were all at the top and did see. It was a sledge, and it was reindeer with bells on their harness. But they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white, but brown. And on this sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall all over his chest. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so red that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also very solemn. "I've come at last," he said. "She has kept me out